Words of James Baldwin. Well, good morning again to everybody. I'm Benjamin Van Dyne, and I'm really happy to be with you in this virtual way, staring at that little green light on my computer that lets me know that you can see me. Whenever I'm wondering what could possibly be said in a particular moment, I find myself turning to these, my 2 volumes of the collected works of James Baldwin. I left my UU hymnal and my Bible and my own journal back in New York when I came down here to Virginia with my kids. But I managed to pick up my volumes of James Baldwin. So I'm glad we're going to be spending some time with Baldwin this morning. Baldwin was one of the great Black writers, one of the great writers of the 20th century. As a novelist and commentator and essayist, he received widespread acclaim for his portrayal of Black and gay life in his fiction and for his incisive analysis of white supremacy in the United States. In the 1950s, in his early 20s, he left his native New York and became part of the large American expatriate community in France. Here, for the first time, he was surrounded by other artists and writers and found a place where he could explore relationships with other men and across racial boundaries in a way that wasn't possible for him at home. Baldwin had been a boy preacher, and his writing still has the cadence of preaching, the openness of testimony, even as the storefront church is so often replaced with the bar or the lover's bedroom or the civil rights meeting. The first time I ever preached, I was 20, and it was exactly 17 years ago, Palm Sunday, almost exactly 17 years ago, I guess, Palm Sunday. 4 months after my mother had died. I was determined at 20 to speak with a capital S, determined to extract wisdom from her dying and her death. I grieved like algebra, or I thought it was grief, and I rendered my mother's death a variable, an X, a cross, calibrated to have just the right value, able to render me a serious person to myself and to other people. But not like too serious, because who wants to hear all the time about my dead mom? At 20, I had read every book on grieving. I felt personally acquainted with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I could, with impressive objectivity, situate myself in the stages of grief. The sermon itself was a liberal religious triumph. It had quotes from all the right people, from Emerson and Thoreau, just the right amount of self-deprecation and self-seriousness, some poetry, some prose, the right amount of corroboration. Elegant, impressive, wise beyond my years. Emily, my younger sister, was wiser than me. She spent her time with her friends and got high. She had no conscious system, no topography of anguish, just some friends and lots of beer and weed. Do people say weed? I was too far removed to know, although I can tell you a lot about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It's not that Emily was without her problems. She can tell her own story, but she was pruned and constrained and used to others' purposes in her own ways. But she also wrote stories sporadically and danced, even though they told her she'd never make a living at it, and cultivated long, tipsy conversations with her friends, which lasted long into the night. Looking back, perhaps I envied that a little bit, but it seemed irresponsible to stay up so late when I had to preach the next morning. All that drinking and getting high seemed beneath me somehow. The narrator of Baldwin's story, Sonny's brother, teaches algebra, the clearest, most paradigmatically pure kind of knowledge, in which not only the answer but the structure of the question is clear. I insisted that my mother had died, not passed or transitioned or any other euphemism. There was to be no speculation about the better place she was in. This clinical straightforwardness was another marker of maturity. I grieved like algebra. When his own daughter dies, it awakens a common bond between our narrator and sunny. My trouble, the narrator says, made his trouble real. I had begun finally to wonder, says our narrator, about Sunny, about the life that Sunny lived inside. He realizes, so to speak, that the hens are cold too. And it's this new openness that leads the narrator to go down and finally see Sunny play the piano, leads him to see the piano playing as something more than a distraction. And so he writes, on the rare occasions when something opens within and the music enters, what we mainly hear or hear corroborated are personal, private, vanishing evocations. But the one who creates the music is hearing something else, is dealing with the roar rising from the void and imposing order on it as it hits the air. What is evoked in him then is of another order, more terrible because it has no words, and triumphant too for that same reason. And his triumph when he triumphs is ours. What Sunny evokes, I think, is what the poet and activist Audre Lorde called the erotic. The word is derived from the Greek eros, the personification of love in all its aspects, born of the goddess chaos and personifying creative power and harmony. It's not specifically about sex, though it shows up there. When I speak of the erotic, Lorde writes, I speak of it as an assertion of the life force of women that may be the antithesis of the sterile Euro-American male tradition. She distinguishes it from the pornographic, which she defines as the opposite of the erotic, mere sensation without feeling. There are frequent attempts, she writes, to equate pornography and eroticism. Because of these attempts, it has become fashionable to separate the spiritual, psychic, and emotional from the political, to see them as contradictory or antithetical. What do you mean, a poetic revolutionary, a meditating gunrunner? In the same way, we have attempted to separate the spiritual and the erotic, she writes, thereby reducing the spiritual to a world of flattened affect, a world of the ascetic, who aspires to feel nothing. For the bridge which connects them is formed by the erotic, the sensual, whose physical, emotional, and psychic expressions of what is deepest and strongest and richest within us being shared, the passions of love in its deepest meanings. Those the words of Audre Lorde. This life force is felt, not described or defined or intellectualized, though intellectual acts can be expressions of it. She gives examples of erotically satisfying activity that include dancing, building a bookcase, and examining an idea, and suggests that we should approach it through the oblique language of poetry. These days, of course, our public life is dominated by the pornographic, by bragging on sexual assault, by easy violence toward children, by the numbing everyday violence of poverty and labor, by the psychic and psychological strain of so many accumulated moments in which feeling the reality of the world is simply unbearable. And so pornographic numbness is preferable. I get the aspiration to feeling nothing. These days we are seeing the pornographies of illness and danger, but also the pornographies of feel-good stories and heroism. So I get the appeal of technocracy, of rational thought, of analysis, of that world that Lorde invokes of the ascetic who aspires to feel nothing. I get the desire to look for the candidates or the platform or the party or the church or the Zoom meeting or the book that is the smartest and makes the most sense. I get the appeal of not only grieving, but of organizing, like algebra. Yet Lorde and Baldwin challenge me here, because I think that in this case, Audre Lorde is right. that the pornographic is not the presence of feeling, but feeling kept at bay. The rage that dominates our public discourse, and to speak frankly, much more on the right than on the left, and much more among white people and among men, is there to crowd out our authentic anger and grief, our authentic connection, the entire erotic world of feeling. And algebraic living is as big a danger to that as explosive rage. As I sit down here in Virginia with my kids, far from where I usually live in the Bronx, and as the horizon of my own time slowly expands, as I go from trying to make it through the next hour to trying to make it through the next day, as I go from making it through the day to making it through the week, from planning the week to planning the month, as my time horizon expands, I feel this pull toward algebra. I am tempted to believe that the kinds of rational thinking and logics that made sense before will save us if only they can be restored. Just as I had when grieving, I imagine that this sort of algebraic life represents a loss of innocence, my cultivation into a serious person. That is what the rage of the right and cold technocratic rationality have in common. They both keep the erotic at bay. But if we follow Baldwin closely, our prophetic word this morning is something of the erotic, something of what Sonny can only find through this grimy life, the life of desperation in terror, this thing that he invokes at the piano that must be kept new at the risk of ruin, destruction, madness, and death, what must always be heard. It's the narrator who glimpses redemption by the end, coming to perceive the erotic power that Sonny conjures over and out of the void, getting down beneath himself somehow, into the mud, the place of sweat and bodies, the place of clowning and punching around on a dance floor. This loss of innocence is our task, and it, grimy and erotic, is the only light we have in all this darkness. The end of innocence, one author quotes Baldwin as saying, means you have finally entered the picture. And it means you'll accept the consequences too. May we finally enter the picture. Consequences be damned. May it be so.